Hello, my name is Jacob Faber, and I'm an associate professor of sociology and public service at New York University. And my research focuses on the role that housing markets and segregation play in exacerbating and reproducing racial inequality. And a large trend of my research focuses on the kind of long-term consequences of federal housing policies adopted during the New Deal. And what I hope to show with this research today is that federal housing policy that was designed to stabilize and increase access to home ownership, but in an explicitly racialized way, was quite effective in doing so. Specifically at places where the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlined certain neighborhoods. Those places became sites of growing inequality in homeownership in subsequent decades. Just to kind of zoom out a second, many of us are familiar with this idea quote from Martin Luther King that in the United States we have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. And this is a really important critique of the United States welfare system. But I think a piece that's often missing from it is what comes before this this choice excerpt. And he contextualizes this point in a discussion of mortgage credit and suburbanization. That suburbia was built with federally subsidized credit, and people of color were largely excluded from this. And this heavily subsidized suburban white life was very much a welfare program, but one that was segregated by race and by place. And this has really important implications for not just racial inequality, but how we think about welfare provision and housing and geography in the United States. So what I'm going to show in this presentation is describe the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Again, we're the first of these massive federal housing policies and where much of my research lies. And they describe the current study that I'm engaged in, share some results and discuss some next steps and implications of this work. And the broad research question here is, how did the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which I'll describe in a little bit, structure and racialize access to homeownership? So we usually think about the Great Depression as an employment crisis, and it absolutely was. Unemployment hit about 25%, and 34 million people belonged to families with no full-time wage earner in the early 1930s. But the Great Depression was also a housing crisis. About half of mortgage debt was in default at the time. Hundreds of thousands of people were evicted from their homes, and millions more became homeless. And in response, Franklin Roosevelt, shown here with the help of a large Democratic majority in Congress, enacted a wide range of policies known as the New Deal, or remedies in this political cartoon. And we can see FDR treating an ill Uncle Sam with dozens of these remedies displayed in acronym form. And many of us are familiar with the alphabet soup comprised of these programs. There were enormous job programs that put millions of people to work on public works projects, the arts, infrastructure, et cetera. This was the birth of the American social safety net. There were labor rights and union protections that were part of this. And there were also massive investments in housing, including the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, or HOLC, shown here in the center of this table, and which I will focus on for much of the rest of today. So HOLC was intended to be short-term relief. It was passed in 1933 to stabilize this crumbling housing market. It made funds available to help homeowners avoid foreclosure and buy back homes lost to foreclosure via refinancing. It granted $3 billion of loans in its first 2 years on over 1 million mortgages, and so touching about a tenth of homes in the United States. So this is a really big program. And it, despite being designed to be short-term in impact, it had two very long-term effects. The first is in that it was really responsible for creating the American Homeownership Society through the institutionalization of the long-term uniform payment mortgage. And it's worth pausing to emphasize how important a change this was. Prior to HOLC, there was no standardized mortgage credit. If you were wealthy, you would bought with cash. Otherwise, you were reliant on what many historians refer to as a kind of patchwork of mortgage policies. So not only did HOLC save this industry, but it established the primary tool for wealth accumulation for most Americans. Wealth that can, appreciate over time, be tapped when income is inconsistent, and be used for intergenerational mobility. And this is in large part why the racist design and implementation and inheritance of HOLC are so important to study. And the primary tool through which HOLC accomplished this was through redlining. Redlining refers to the denial of mortgage credit to communities of color. So HOLC hired appraisers to grade neighborhoods in hundreds of cities across the country. Neighborhoods got one of four grades, A being the best grade, D being the worst grade. If we look at HOLC's, they were called residential security maps, HOLC's residential security map of Atlanta. And D grades were sites where housing finance became much harder to come by, if not impossible, in subsequent decades. And grades were based on housing conditions, economic activity, and perhaps most importantly, race. Appraisers provided rich descriptions of each of these neighborhoods, justifying the grades, which is why we know that race was almost an obsession among appraisers. And I'm going to show an excerpt from this neighborhood here, this redlined neighborhood here in central Atlanta. So this is about a third or a quarter of the narrative that came along with the justification of this grade. And we can see at the very top, we see lists of favorable and detrimental influences. And under detrimental influences, we have income instability, mixture of racial groups, juvenile delinquency, infant mortality, crime, etc. And then below, we see a description of the inhabitants of this neighborhood. And you'll note that percent Negro is the only racial category here. And Nathan Conley, Ken Jackson, David Freund, and others who have conducted deeper analyses of the narratives have documented a real obsession or preoccupation of appraisers with the presence of Black households. Here's another residential security map for Durham, North Carolina. And we can see that this neighborhood got a red grade because it was formerly a, quote, good white residential street, but Negroes are gradually taking up the area. So this kind of threat of what appraisers refer to as infiltration was seen as an enormous negative amenity. Contrasted to this neighborhood in the north, it got a green grade, in part because of the wealthy faculty, Duke University faculty that lived in this neighborhood. To give a scale of, to give a sense of the scale of this redlining effort, the Digital Scholarship Lab created this mapping inequality project where they've digitized every HOLC map and made available online all of these maps for free. So you can go to this website and look at all of these maps, and you can see here that they really covered a large portion of the United States. Their mandate, which I'll get into in a little bit, was primarily to grade large cities. And given the population distribution at the time, again, in the 1930s, there was really good coverage in the Midwest, the Rust Belt, the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and a fair bit in the South, less so in the West. But HOLC was HOLC was a long time ago, and so it's worth thinking about related historical processes and where HOLC fits in all of this. So, you know, starting with the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the GI Bill, or the Veterans Administration's lending, these programs inherited HOLC's redlining practices and expanded the use of restrictive covenants. You can see an excerpt of a restrictive covenant here, excluding the sale of property to Blacks and as well as Jews and Syrians and some other groups. These programs were much bigger than HOLC, and they funneled billions of dollars away from urban communities of color and towards white suburbs. By 1972, FHA helped 11 million households buy homes, and fewer than 1% of those loans went to Black households. As homeownership opportunities opened up to whites, we were building segregated public housing, using highways as opportunities to segregate neighborhoods and connect suburban bedroom communities to job centers. We were displacing hundreds of thousands, disproportionately people of color, through urban renewal. And this conflation of race and lending risk institutionalized by HOLC constrained housing markets, housing options for Blacks, creating opportunities for exploitation through practices such as the block busting. And private lenders also adopted redlining practices of these federal policies. And many scholars position this as an extension of Jim Crow, as well as more contemporary lending inequality. So HOLC, of course, did not invent racism in real estate, but it institutionalized it, setting these and other processes in motion. And borrowing from Keeauge-Yamahtta Taylor's great book, Race for Profit, this all happened during a massive shift in American social and economic culture, where home ownership kind of became this kind of central piece to conceptions of American citizenship and belonging, but of course in a highly racialized way. And this is why some, including David Freund, argue that the actual lending record of HOLC is far less significant than the kind of appraisal logic that HOLC introduced to the national mortgage market, as well as the creation of this financial instrument, which made white Americans investors in segregation. So my analytical strategy is designed to, in pursuit of a rather simple task, exploring racial differences in home ownership and suburbanization in places that were exposed to HOLC appraisals and places that were not. I focus on Black-white differences for a number of reasons. Again, HOLC appraisals were quite sensitive to the presence of Black residents. Even a single Black person in a neighborhood could give it a D grade. The Black-white color line was and is stronger than other racial boundaries, especially regarding residential segregation. And data consistency is also an issue here. Census categorization of Latinos and Asians changed far more dramatically during the 20th century than the definitions of white and Black. And that's largely due to dramatic changes in immigration policy in the 1960s. The ideal data for this project would include longitudinal measures of race and socioeconomic status, housing characteristics, and geography for people before HOLC's implementation and afterwards. Unfortunately, those data don't exist, so I'm reliant on imperfect measures of changing racial geography from multiple census data sources, which I'll discuss in a second. So I use individual level data from the IPUMS USA website for every census between 1910 and 2000, excluding 1950, because there are no housing variables in that data set, and 1970, where geography is hard to measure due to data privacy requirements. And I also add several American Community Survey samples from the 21st century to capture more recent trends, as well as changes in the housing market due to the subprime lending crisis and foreclosure crisis. There are over 68 million individual records across these data sets. So I first take a 50% sample of each of these data sets, and then again, I'm only focusing on Black and white individuals who have full covariate data, and individuals who are living in counties that were part of a metropolitan area in 1900, or became part of a metropolitan area during the time period of study. So in the end, I have just over 14.5 million observations in this data set. My primary measures are for HOLC appraisal are whether a metropolitan area had a HOLC map. And there's an important indigeneity concern here, which I'll discuss at the end, where guidelines for HOLC requested maps for all cities with populations above 40,000. My primary outcomes are homeownership and home values. Homeownership is available for all of the years in this study. Home values are the census only started asking in 1930, so I'm limited to that. And then there are some models that use some measures of sociodemographic characteristics, including marital status, sex, age, occupational score, et cetera. My analytical strategy is a triple difference model, or difference and differences, where I estimate an outcome of interest, such as homeownership, as a function of a three-way interaction between a person's race, whether or not they lived in a metropolitan area that was appraised by HOLC, and whether or not they're living in a time period after HOLC, so 1940 and later. I'm primarily interested in these two coefficients, beta 5, which can be interpreted as the estimated impact of HOLC on whites, and beta 6, which is the estimated white-black difference in impact. There are models, again, that use individual level sociodemographic characteristics. All my models, not all my models, but many of the models use metropolitan area fixed effects, census division by year fixed effects. I'm weighting my models by IPUMS person weights, and I'm clustering standard errors at the metropolitan level. So just descriptively here, we can see changes in homeownership rates by race and exposure to the Homeowners Loan Corporation's appraisal maps. And a couple of things jump out here. First, that homeownership rose both for Blacks and for whites in the middle of the 20th century, though faster for whites and fastest in particular for whites living in HOLC appraised areas. And so the racial gap in homeownership in appraised areas in 1930 was just under 25% compared to just over 23% in unappraised areas. And both of these gaps increased, but the gap increased most dramatically in appraised places, up to almost 31% by 2019. And we see similar patterns when we look at home value as well. And we don't have as many pre-HOLC data points here, but the white-black gap in home value was larger in HOLC appraised places than unappraised places, but it really exploded by 2019. I'm just going to show a series of coefficient plots SF of my model estimates. Again, I'm using region by year fixed effects in all of these models, and standard errors are clustered at the metropolitan level. So first, looking at the estimated impact of HOLC on whites, you can see that for both homeownership and home value, there appears to be strong and significant estimated effects of HOLC on both these outcomes, and the magnitude of these effects seems rather insensitive to model specification. So including covariates, which is the orange dot, or covariates and metropolitan fixed effects, which is orange and blue. When we look at the beta 6 here, the estimated white-black difference, we also see patterns in support of the hypothesis that HOLC increased racial inequality, that there are strong negative and highly significant coefficients that again seem relatively insensitive to model specification. So at least some initial evidence here suggesting that HOLC did indeed increase racial inequality in housing outcomes. Unsurprisingly, suburbanization played a really important role in all of this. And of course, defining suburbs is tricky business, especially kind of change over time in suburban definitions. I have through IPUMS multiple different ways to measure or estimate, I suppose, suburbanization, and across 4 different measures of suburbanization, there's pretty strong and consistent evidence that white individuals living in HOLC exposed areas became far less likely over time to live in central cities, and Blacks became far more likely over time to live in central cities, again, in support of hypothesis that HOLC increased a racialized suburban movement among whites. And when we look at city, suburb, location, and homeownership together, we also find some interesting patterns here. So each of these points is a coefficient from a separate regression, and the regressions are of 4 different outcomes. One, whether or not you live in a city as a renter, whether you live in the city as a homeowner, whether you live in the suburbs as a renter, and whether you own in the suburbs. And again, looking at this 2-way interaction between the post-HOLC period indicator variable and the exposure to HOLC variable, we can see very strong evidence that whites in HOLC appraised places fled cities. They became far, far less likely to own or especially rent within cities that were appraised by HOLC, and far, far, far more likely to become owners and renters in suburbs. And then there's a really interesting kind of story here among African Americans where they were essentially not allowed to become owners in suburbs. This red coefficient here is highly significant and negative. The suburban renter coefficient here is negative but not significant. And interestingly, there's a positive and significant effect of HOLC on not just renting within cities, but also owning within cities. And this is a piece that's not often cited within the literature, kind of suggesting that HOLC may have increased homeownership among African Americans, but only within cities. And there's another way to kind of visualize this trend by kind of stacking each of these outcomes, or the probability of each of these outcomes over time across, again, each of these 4 different treatment categories, racial makeup, white or Black, and then whether or not an individual lived in a place that was exposed to HOLC. And we can see that among whites, there was, and these are the 2 charts on the left, that suburbanization really exploded in HOLC places among white Americans, and city homeownership, which was on the rise before HOLC, plummeted, and it really kind of disappeared, especially by about 2000. Whereas compared to whites, Black city homeownership continued to increase quite a bit after HOLC. Again, kind of reinforcing this idea that HOLC may have increased a kind of racially contingent homeownership, geographically contingent homeownership for African Americans. So, moving forward with this research, first to summarize it, it seems pretty clear that HOLC facilitated a process of housing becoming a site of extreme racial inequality. Black homeownership did rise over the course of the 20th century, but today it remains about a century behind white homeownership. Whites left appraised cities in large numbers, while African Americans bought in many of these places where housing markets were declining, and therefore homeownership became a far less valuable financial investment for African Americans, contributing to the racial wealth gap over time. It's worth kind of noting that the kind of mechanisms here are still somewhat of a black box, but I think that this kind of insight into the kind of homeownership within cities versus homeownership within the suburbs is a really important contribution to our understanding of kind of how HOLC facilitated a racialized development of the metropolis that emerged over the 20th century. Mobility, both in terms of timing, there were large migrations within and across states during this time period are worth kind of giving a little bit more attention. And of course, again, this kind of indigeneity issue here in results that I don't show here in the interest of time, I adopt an identification strategy similar to prior work of mine that exploits the fact that these HOLC guidelines for appraising cities with large populations was kind of imperfectly implemented. There was a lot of spillover. There are places that were below the 40,000 person threshold that HOLC appraisers was supposed to use that were appraised for some reason, and there were many places that were many cities that were larger than that, including Washington, D.C., that we don't have HOLC maps for. And the homeownership results kind of still still stand within those robustness checks. Kind of linking this again to kind of broader historical trends and investments in investments in urban inequality, such as urban renewal, as well as, again, these much larger housing programs, is a continuing area of work of mine, because this kind of historical context is really crucial. So in wrap, I'd just say thank you again for listening to this talk, and I appreciate again the opportunity to share this work.